Welcome Space Engineers to Dyson Sphere Program. If you've been following my achievement videos, there may have been many times where I've said, I just use a blueprint for this. Well, if you've been curious how exactly my builds work, today we're going to go through the first half of my blueprint books that I use to play this game. For starters, let's take a look at my first blueprint book, which I've labeled the Starter Kit. The Starter Kit contains blueprints for when I first start a new game, and finishes after I've unlocked interstellar logistics stations. In the first row, we're building some basic materials, electromagnetic matrices, and all the basic starting machines. Let's do that now. These first two blueprints provide basic materials to help get your game started. I've labeled the inputs you need on the conveyor belts for you as well. We need a full belt of stone, 2 full belts of iron ore, and a full belt of copper ore to get this running. Since we're in the early stages of the game, we need to get some research started to unlock all the recipes. Here I have two options. You can either start by making electromagnetic matrices at 1 per second or 2 per second. Pick whichever works for you. Each of those blueprints is meant to connect directly to our existing blueprint like so. If you have a steady income of iron and copper ore, this should help you clear all the early research that requires electromagnetic matrices. What comes next is building the hub that will help automate production of all of your machines. I'm leaving the placement of this up to you since I can't predict what the starting planet you're building on will look like, and there's usually lots of annoying water everywhere. To help guide you, the outputs of the basic materials simply have to be connected to their matching inputs. Just remember that as long as you're actively using research, almost none of the circuit boards or magnetic coils will make it through here. This is one of the reasons why you should run with the other blueprint that only makes 1 per second. That said, when you're done with all the early research, you can just dismantle it anyway. The second part of the hub connects directly to the first. Match the icons on the conveyor belts like this. Now that you have a steady supply of machines, you can either finish building the hub, or you can use one of my 3 additional blueprints depending on how your base is behaving. My coal power blueprint takes 2 full lanes of coal and converts them into energetic graphite. At 100% power consumption, a full lane of energetic graphite can power 15 thermal power plants. There's also a small box at the end, since you'll probably want some of these for yourself. Your starting world always has a lot of water on it, so this foundations blueprint will help you deal with that. It produces foundations at 1.5 per second, but if you upgrade those 2 assemblers, it'll run at 2 per second. There's also another small box at the end to hold the excess steel if you need to handcraft any machines that require them. I've designed the blueprint that makes solar panels to take a whopping 4 full lanes of stone. However, you'll need to manually supply the copper ingots and circuit boards into the 2 boxes below. Now that our infrastructure is stable, let's go back and finish the hub. This one connects a little bit differently. Place the far right assembler in the blueprint so that it overlaps with the far left one that already exists. The only thing you have left to do to get the newer machines up and running is to provide a supply of glass and steel from the top. Once you finish with that, our starter hub is complete, and this should provide you with everything you need for quite a while. The next step is to automate the first 3 matrices. We first start with electromagnetic, or blue matrices. With a full belt of iron ore and half a belt of copper ore, we can make these at 2 per second. As for the output, I'm leaving it up to you where and how to consume those matrices. Before we build our energy, or red matrix blueprints, we need a temporary build first to get enough matrices to research X-ray cracking. This build only requires crude oil at 2 per second, so a single oil extractor should be enough. You'll need to hand feed 800 energetic graphite into here to complete the production. If you built one of the coal plants, they should have enough. Once you've built 400 energy matrices, you can research X-ray cracking and drop the real blueprint. Since our blueprint tech will be limited to 300 machines, this is split into 2 parts. The first blueprint requires crude oil at 4 per second and runs X-ray cracking to process it. You may want this section to run for a minute before placing down the second blueprint. The second blueprint overlaps the first, like this. This will now produce energy matrices at 2 per second, and the excess hydrogen produced will be fed into some thermal power plants for extra energy. Now it's time to produce structure matrices in order to unlock our interstellar logistics. You'll need mass construction technology to be at least level 3 before you can continue. Like before, this is split into 2 parts. This blueprint has several inputs. You need 2 full lanes of coal and 2 full lanes of crude oil, or running at least 5 per second. You need 2 per second water, which is the equivalent of 3 water pumps, and a supply of either titanium ingots or titanium ore, which will eventually be fed with a logistics station. This also produces excess hydrogen as well, so keep an eye on that. For the water, you don't need to supply both ends. Just feed one side, then flip the other side's belt to make things easier. After feeding our structure matrix production the titanium that it wants, it's time for the last step. You'll need to research mass construction level 4, drones, vessels, and interstellar logistic technologies before building the next one. This one will take even more inputs, but will leapfrog us right into interstellar logistics. This blueprint requires 2.5 full belts of iron ore, a full belt of copper ore, a full belt of silicon ore, crude oil running at 4 per second, water running at 3 per second, a full belt of stone, coal at 2 per second, and titanium at 3 per second. This blueprint isn't built with perfect ratios, but it will slowly and surely supply you with interstellar logistic stations, drones, and vessels. Once they start being built, you can replace the belt spaghetti you used to hook all of this up with stations, as well as go back and fix the structure matrix build so that everything is automated. Before we move on to the next book, let me explain how I like to play this game from this point forward. In a regular game, I like my blueprints to be completely self-contained and independent. They end up being more complex, but as long as you have a stable supply of common materials, they will run on their own at 100%. In order to do this, I have to set up a couple ground rules. First, what are the common materials that I expect? These include all the natural resources you can mine, like iron, copper, stone, coal, and water. It also includes some of the more uncommon resources like crude oil, silicon ore, titanium ore, sulfuric acid, and organic crystals. It also includes some of the more advanced resources like hydrogen, deuterium, fire ice, and critical photons from our Dyson spheres. Near the end game, it will also include the more rare resources like kimberlite, fractal silicon, optical grading crystals, spiniform, and unipolar magnets. However, we're not going to use those rare resources until much later. In addition to resources, we also want some common items in our logistic network as well. This includes Proliferator Mark II and III, warpers, graviton lenses, and to a certain extent, quantum chips as well. To make any of the mineable resources available to the logistics network, simply hook up your miners to a logistics station and set the resource to supply. The station doesn't need to be powered, as I'm making it the responsibility of those who request it to send out the vessels. With all this in mind, let's continue the tour. The next book I call The Logistics Hub, and it contains several blueprints that, in theory, you'll only need to put each of them down once. These will supply our galaxy's logistics with all the machines you'll ever need. Like with my first book, you want to build them in order from left to right. We start with proliferators, sulfuric acid, sorter Mark III, conveyor Mark III, and assembler Mark II. Since at this stage of the game, Assembler Mark III isn't possible until we have quantum chips, for now we're only going to be using Mark II assemblers until we hit mission complete. Also, the reason we have a sulfuric acid build is because we're eventually going to request it remotely from a planet with a sulfuric acid ocean, but since we haven't unlocked warpers yet, we need a temporary build to supply our base with some in the beginning. Later on, after we've unlocked warpers, we can dismantle this build. The same goes for organic crystals. We're eventually going to be mining them from another system, but for now we want to make them locally first. Lastly, once all 5 of these builds are up and running and you're supplying them with all the resources they need, you should use the machines they make to upgrade everything you see here. In the blueprint book, there are 5 duplicate blueprints for all of these that use the upgraded machines if you need to rebuild them. I call the next big blueprint Common Machines. This one replaces the hub we first built at the beginning of the game. This massive blueprint will produce all of the original hub machines and add a few new ones, like the traffic monitor, the spray coater, the automatic piler, and the geothermal power station. Once this is built, you can dismantle your original hub. Next up is 2 familiar faces. We have foundations and solar panels. As an additional tip, if you're like me and like paving large amounts of land, you'll probably want multiple foundation factories. I recommend building at least 4 of these. We also have our first major fuel upgrade, as well as a way to start dealing with the excess hydrogen we've been making: proliferated hydrogen fuel rods. While the original Jumpstart Interstellar Logistics blueprint works well, it produces everything rather slowly. Now it's time to produce logistics for a massive scale. Between these next 3 blueprints, the Interstellar Logistics Station blueprint right here is pretty big, so make sure you have enough space and power for it. Down below are the 2 blueprints for drones and vessels. Once you finish this part, you're technically ready to move on to my next book that works on Dyson spheres and research. But for now, let's continue making more machines. The next 2 blueprints set up fractionating, and where there's deuterium, there's our next fuel source. First, we have a small build that makes fractionators. Then, a build that uses pilers to fractionate our hydrogen into deuterium. Lastly, now that we have access to deuterium, we have a build that makes proliferated deuteron fuel rods. This new fuel source is going to last us for a very long time. Next up are 2 blueprints that will allow us to build our EM rail ejectors and ray receivers, which we'll need when we start building our Dyson spheres. Next up is a build that automates energy exchangers. I don't use these that often. It really depends on whether my starting systems can make a lot of power. They are, however, needed for the next build that makes orbital collectors. This one's another large blueprint, and it actually consumes your supply of interstellar logistics stations in order to work, so use it wisely. Next is a build for satellite substations, particle colliders, and if you have 180 megawatts of power lying around, here's a blueprint that uses particle colliders to convert hydrogen into deuterium at a faster rate and output them at 30 per second. I don't use satellite substations until the endgame, but maybe your playstyle will be different than mine. Also, it's only after you have a high demand for deuterium that you'll need this much of it. Lastly, we're adding one more common material to our logistics network that we're going to be using in some of our future builds, the organic crystals. Before we unlock warpers and manually mine these, this factory can produce them at 1.2 per second. You can stamp down a few, depending on your supply of oil and the demand of organic crystals from your other factories. Now we're getting into some of the more complex machines that you probably won't need to build for a while. The first up is the vertical launch silo. Unlike everything else, this one will also require a supply of graviton lenses and quantum chips in the logistics network. The blueprints to make those are available in the next book. Next up, we have blueprints to make advanced miners and plane smelters. These require some special ingredients, so these blueprints won't be useful until you have a supply of warpers in your network to bring everything in. Advanced miners will need spiniform, optical grading crystals, and quantum chips. Plain smelters will need unipolar magnets, spiniform, optical grading crystals, and fire ice. If we're starting to drop blueprints that require quantum chips, it only makes sense that we include Assembler Mark III into all of this. For this blueprint, I'm also using spiniform and fractal silicon for its production. Lastly, the final 3 blueprints I don't use until I start using my 4th blueprint book. Proliferator Mark III, which uses spiniform and kimberlite, proliferated antimatter fuel rods, the best fuel you can get in the game, which also requires critical photons from your Dyson spheres, and artificial stars, which need antimatter fuel rods. These also require spiniform and quantum chips for their production. This completes the largest book I have, which I use to make all the stuff needed for everything else. If you're using these blueprints, you'll notice that every logistics station has a slot reserved for warpers. This is intentional. Once you unlock warpers and supply the galaxy with them, all of these blueprints will be able to fetch resources from outside their current system, as well as provide all the machines to any new systems that you set up. My next book is called The Galactic Network. I use this to expand to new planets, to build solar sails and rockets needed for Dyson spheres, and to build all the research needed to unlock universe matrices and hit mission complete. The first 3 blueprints are used when you expand to a new planet. The first one allows you to import all the machines we created earlier. I call it the Planet Starter. You can place this at either the North or South Pole, and you'll need to have 8 interstellar logistics stations with you to do this. This little hub sets up the ability to quickly import a lot of machines. By default, everything is set to storage, so we're not wasting machines yet. If you need something, simply flip the switch and ask for it. These stations also don't require any power or vessels to operate. Everything we built before will take care of transporting those items to us. I do have one exception though, and that is warpers. You don't ever want to catch yourself being stranded on another planet without a supply of these. If you also need to transport any machines or items I haven't included, I've left several empty slots you can use. Next up is providing some power to the entire planet. I'm giving you 2 choices here. You can build a ring of power across all the tropics using solar panels, or you can build a ring that's made up of half solar panels and half wind generators. The latter is usually most efficient unless the planet you're building on has either terrible wind or amazing solar energy. To place these, first find one of the 4 prime meridians on your planet and put Icarus there for reference. Then, start placing one of those 2 blueprints. Line up the power poles along the meridian. At this point, you have 2 options if you're having trouble placing it. You can either fly around all the meridians and tropics on the planet, burying all the veins and flattening all the craters with foundations, or you can use the new feature that came with a recent patch and just force whatever works and fix it later. A highly recommended option. Every blueprint from this point onward will use proliferation, so always make sure your production of Mark II proliferators can keep up. Now our target is to work our way through all the matrices, including information, gravity, and universe matrices. For starters, we need a bunch of matrix labs that will import all the other matrices through logistics, so build that first. Now it's time to start building all of the matrices one at a time. The original ones you already made for electromagnetic, energy, and structure matrices can be torn down at this point, unless you're still running some of the research with them. Ideally, to hit universe matrix production and mission complete without leaving our starting system, a production of 2 per second is ideal. With proliferation, they'll actually be producing at 2.4 per second, and there's a 20% bonus when it hits the labs on top of that. With logistics, the electromagnetic, energy, and structure matrices are all actually quite small. Information and gravity matrices, though, can easily take up half the planet. Not only is the information matrix blueprint longer than the other 3 combined, you also need 2 of them to match their production. However, like I said before, As long as you provide all the raw ingredients it needs, this will provide you with all the information matrices you need. What I set up for gravity matrices will actually take up twice the space as what I had set up for information matrices. It comes in 3 parts. To build it, we need to produce graviton lenses and quantum chips. I built these to a common ratio. One blueprint of graviton lenses and another for quantum chips will match one blueprint for the green matrix production. Once those 2 are set up, we drop a tiny build that puts it all together that makes gravity matrices. Like before with information matrices, you're going to need 2 of these in order to hit a production of 2.4 per second like everything else. Even if you build 2 of each of these blueprints, it doesn't stop there. It's at this point where we actually want to build a 3rd pair of graviton lenses and quantum chips in order to build our warpers for our galaxy's logistics network. If everything was set up correctly, including an active supply of proliferation, we're able to produce about 700 warpers a minute. As long as this keeps running, we'll probably never run out of warpers for the rest of the game. Now it's time to work on blueprints that will build out our Dyson Sphere. This first blueprint will produce solar sails at 9.6 per second. If you need a bigger production, just stamp down multiple copies. This blueprint uses sulfuric acid and coal to produce solar sails, since fire ice might not always be available to everyone by this point. If you want to use fire ice, I have a better blueprint for that in the next book. The second blueprint may look a little familiar. It's similar to the deuteron fuel rods from before, but it's scaled to match our small carrier rocket build, which produces them at 7.2 per minute. The small carrier rocket build requires solar sails, deuteron fuel rods, and quantum chips in order to operate. Now that we've hit all the major research milestones and created Dyson spheres to farm critical photons from, it's time to build our universe matrix production. If we finished all the research before universe matrices, then we can dismantle the lab research blueprint from before and replace it with this one. This blueprint will turn critical photons into antimatter, producing excess hydrogen, combine it with all the matrices from before into universe matrices, then consume them into research as well. This blueprint scales with the others. For every 2.4 per second you're producing, you'll need one of these blueprints. With all of this set up, you'll now hit mission complete and start with the endgame research. Now we're on to the final book, which focuses on the endgame. I call this one the Galactic Megabase. This one is very similar to the last book, but here's what's changed. All the machines, items, and resources that are used have been upgraded to the best possible. We're now using Mark III proliferators, Mark III assemblers, and plane smelters. We're also now expecting all resources to be available on the logistics network as well. Lastly, each matrix blueprint has been scaled up from 2.4 per second to 15 per second. We're targeting this much because if you double it, it matches the speed of the fastest belt at 30 per second. To start with, let's look at the new Planet Starter blueprint. This one is practically the same as the other one, except that it's importing a lot of the basic machines by default. It's also importing the better smelters and assemblers instead. The next 2 blueprints are what I use if I need massive amounts of power on my planets in systems that I've built Dyson spheres in. At the pole opposite of my starter planet, I can drop one or both of these, which cover multiple tropics with ray receivers, and imports graviton lenses for maximum output. The first blueprint sits on the pole itself, while the second blueprint goes right below it. You can actually mix the second blueprint with the Planet Starter blueprint as well if you want to. The next 2 blueprints after that are exactly the same as the last book. It makes rings of solar panels and some wind turbines to cover the planet with power. Now it's time to get into the most complicated blueprints I have. Let me show you the difference between the first and second graviton lens blueprint. The first one produces them at 0.6 per second, or 36 a minute. The second one produces them at a little bit more than 3.1 per second, which is about 186 per minute. This means the second blueprint will produce them 5 times faster, but only takes up a little over twice the space. You might also notice there's no blueprint for quantum chips this time around. That's because all of the new blueprints have them built in instead. Next up, I'm giving you 2 options. You can either build solar sails using coal and sulfur at 15 per second, or you can build solar sails using fire ice, which will produce a hydrogen byproduct, but produce them at 23.5 per second. Ideally, only build the second one if you have another build on the same planet that can consume it. A long time ago, I made millions of solar sails that way, and I kept running into problems with excess hydrogen production. If you're making them with coal and sulfur, you'll never run into that problem. Also, the new small carrier rocket blueprint that comes next doesn't depend on your solar sail production anymore. This time, it's handling those on its own. Now we're getting into some really big blueprints. This next one takes up 1/4 of the planet along the entire equator, but for a good reason. Unlike the previous rocket blueprint that makes them at 7.2 per minute, this one makes them at 2.5 per second, which adds up to 150 per minute. Be careful, this build takes up a lot of power. You need to have about 10 to 12 gigawatts available for this whole thing to run. Also, unlike the other builds, you don't have to supply this one with proliferators either. Those are built in. Now let's move on to matrix production. Like before, the first 3 matrices don't take up a lot of space. These 3 builds each produce 15 per second, so it's pretty trivial if you want to build them multiple times. Don't forget to supply them with Mark III proliferators that you make from the blueprint in the logistics book. Also, like before, information and gravity matrices will take up a lot more space, and each blueprint will only produce half as much. You'll need 2 of them to produce at a rate of 15 per second. If you're targeting 30 per second, you'll need 4. That's going to take up a lot of space around your planet, and a lot of power as well. Now that all the other matrices are being produced, we can now drop the final blueprint that requests critical photons and puts everything together. While it does produce them at 6.25 per second, it consumes matrices at 5 per second. This means if you're producing 15 per second, you'll need 3 of these. If you're producing at 30 per second, you'll need 6 of these. Like before, consuming the matrices for research is also built in, so this is where the production line ends. Of course, we can't forget about harvesting critical photons for ourselves. This next blueprint is similar to the ones that place ray receivers around the poles for power. It supplies the ray receivers with graviton lenses and sends critical photons back to the logistics station. Last, and most definitely not least, we have my biggest and final blueprint. This is a world blueprint that uses 40,000 machines to produce universe matrices all on its own at 18.75 per second. In fact, it's not the worst idea in the world to skip the previous matrix production blueprints entirely and place this one down instead. It does require a Dyson Sphere with at least 75 gigawatts of power to even run. This blueprint will produce universe matrices all on its own, and you definitely don't want to use the new force paste feature with this one. Make sure to place it down on a planet where all the veins have been hidden and the oceans have been covered with foundations first. When you've finished placing it, it looks something like this. I used a couple of these in my last playthrough of this game, which is why you keep seeing that frame rate counter at the top left pop in and out all the time. This completes all the important blueprints that I used for Dyson Sphere Program. There's probably a few glitches here and there, and in my next playthrough I'll try to fix them up. But I hope these help anyone that's having trouble building or needs some inspiration with making blueprints on their own. Next time, I'll go over the blueprint books I used for the 10-hour speedrun achievement. Before I go, here's a quick rundown on how to add blueprints to your game. First, you can download my blueprints by following the links in the description. Blueprints are simply text files that sit on your computer, and blueprint books are simply the folders that contain them. The file names are important because I use that to help put everything in the correct order. If you want to add blueprints to your game, open up the blueprint screen in the game, then click the Show and Explore button. This is the folder where you want to put everything in. You can either extract zip files into here directly, or copy the blueprint text files into their own folders. If you're not 100% sure exactly how to do this, remember to make backups of those folder contents if something's already there, or ask in the comments if you need more help. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.